One of the things that we want to do in the conference this year is to accept something that God is doing, and that is that He is using the prayer group as a very strong positive force for the renewal. And many of us that come from prayer groups have, as Steve said in his talk, been awfully shy about that for a long time, feeling that somehow we were second-class citizens in the renewal, and really because we hankered after becoming more of a community. And I think one of the things that God spoke to me strongest when I was preparing the workshop was reminding me of a certain passage in Romans 12 where the Lord speaks to individual Christians and says, I've given you a gift and I want you to be what you are. Don't try to be more than I'm making you now. Don't try to do something beyond the gift and the faith that I've given you. And I think that He gave me that for a reason, that He wants us to take an accurate and hard look at what He's given us and what He wants us to be. And if we're called to be a prayer group, we're called to do that in the best possible way. He has a reason. And there's a reason why, for example, the group that I'm with in Grand Haven is a well-organized prayer group on the way to becoming something of a community in the future. And the elements of becoming a community are there, but when you look at what we are, we look like a very well-organized prayer group, and I think that's what we ought to be where we are for a lot of reasons. One of the things that we're trying to do in the talks is to help people see the differences so that we can go about doing what we're doing better. And one of the differences between prayer groups and communities is the kind of authority that the leaders groups have. And so the first thing that I want to do in the talk is to talk about the kind of responsibility, very briefly, that a leaders team has in their prayer group and how that differs from the responsibilities of the leaders of a Christian community, of a community that is the kind that Steve was talking about this morning. I'm going to use the word leaders team to talk about heads of prayer groups, because I think that we use different names to mean the same thing. Some people use the word pastoral teams to mean the heads of prayer groups, but some people use that word to mean heads of community as well. There's a full community in Providence that calls their elders group the pastoral team. But what I'm talking about, I'll describe. I'm talking about that group of leaders that has overall responsibility for the activities that a prayer group shares together. Steve said this morning that a prayer group is a group of men and women who have put something together. They share something of their life. At least they share some common activities. They come to the same prayer meetings. They may have something more than a prayer meeting. They may have a second service meeting. They may have some kind of special service teachings that they call people to. They may be involved in some apostolate together. The pastoral team or the leaders team in a prayer group would be responsible for whatever those people do together. You wouldn't expect to find much of a pastoral team or leaders team in what Steve classified as an unorganized prayer group. And you'd expect to find a defined leaders group, a pastoral team or a service team or some kind of committee of leaders in a more developed situation that Steve classified as an organized prayer group. An organized prayer group would be one that may have a second meeting to get the people who are committed to serve the open prayer meeting together. And it would offer Life in the Spirit seminars. It might offer a prayer room after the prayer meeting and an explanation room before and after, or at some point in their life together. It might even do more than that. But whatever that group does, that's what the heads of the group would have responsibility for. And that doesn't mean that the pastoral team or the leaders team does everything. It means that they're ultimately responsible to see that who is taking care of these areas do it right. They're where the buck stops. And in well-organized prayer groups that are on the way to becoming limited communities, the leaders team does not deliberately encourages others to take responsibility in those areas so that ministry can come alive in all the various areas of the prayer group's life, so that the prayer group can be fostering a move ahead, perhaps, if the Lord calls, to a limited community where people can be doing more than just receiving something at the prayer meeting. I suspect that most people who are here are already in situations like that we're already in well-organized prayer meetings. And so I don't want to talk too much about unorganized groups, except to say that one reason why unorganized prayer groups fail, I think, why many of them pass off the scene, and people who are in Ann Arbor tell me that they have news every day of a prayer group here or there that had to fold down for some reason. And one of the commonest reasons is that they began to grow, things began to happen, and they didn't know how to handle it. There are a lot of reasons why groups don't know how to handle it. But one weakness that prevents groups from handling the growth God gives, I think, is their failure to have some kind of formally organized leaders team to take responsibility for it. If God is doing something among us, I think He calls us to be responsible for it, even in prayer groups as well as in full communities. Whatever God is doing among us, He expects us to be good stewards of it. And therefore, as we see God moving, bringing growth of one kind or another, that may be an indication from the Lord that He wants us to begin to say, okay, now that this is happening, who is going to be responsible for it? I'd like to say a word about why I'm suggesting there need to be teams, leaders' teams in the renewal. In a lot of groups, there is a very strong leader, and in some groups, that person becomes the sole leader. And I'd like to suggest that I think that the move of the Lord generally in the renewal is in the direction of establishing teams for a number of reasons. One reason is that prayer groups need a number of different kinds of gifts to make them work right. And it's very rare that one person would possess all of the kinds of gifts, both natural and spiritual, to make a group go right. A prayer group needs somebody that understands what God is doing with the group, a vision for the group, the kind of positive vision that Steve described today. A prayer group needs somebody that can understand how to build a meeting or structure a group, who can understand what the best kind of leadership is for this group. A prayer group needs somebody that can teach clearly to help the group understand what God is doing. And it needs other gifts as well. They have to work together. The kind of thing, for example, that Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 4. In order for the body to grow up into being the full man that God wants it to be, there has to be a combination of gifts. And I think it's just a basic, sound scriptural principle that we ought to look to a body of leaders rather than a sole leader, recognizing that both natural and spiritual gifts are dispersed in the body of men and women who are gathering and are not normally the sole possession of one person. Another reason why I think we need to have teams is to protect groups from the kinds of dangers that strong leaders get themselves into, and to protect the leaders themselves. Because it's what tends to happen, and what's happening in some groups as I see it around the country, is that there are some cases where very strong leaders who find it very hard to submit their mind to the testing of other brothers and sisters are getting themselves into difficulty. That is, they have a vision, they do a lot of good, their groups become very successful, and yet somehow something in their strength makes them resist submitting. I'm that kind of person myself, so I feel free to talk about that. I'm a very strong leader in my community. But one of the reasons why I feel that our community is protected against my tendency to get ahead and to push too hard or to want something to happen is that very early in our life we talked about this, and I decided that I would have to submit my vision of things to the brothers and sisters on a leader's team. And therefore what happens now in leading our group is that all of us share together what God seems to be saying to the whole group, and nobody, even the strongest person on the team, does anything without the cooperation, the checking, and the testing of the others. That protects me from error, from, for example, taking the Grand Haven group somewhere where God doesn't want it to go. There's a strong temptation to move ahead. And we're in a situation where moving ahead would ruin what God is trying to do in the Grand Haven area. When I come back from a conference, the brother coordinators there, I'll say, okay, give Bert a week to cool off. Let's give all those ideas a chance to run around and come out, and then we'll get back down to the work of doing what God wants to do here and not what he wants to do in Ann Arbor or in New Orleans or wherever else the ideas come from. There's also, I'm going to talk about mutual submission tomorrow a little bit, and there are other kinds of things that need to be said about it, but the point here is that I think that it makes a lot of sense if we're moving in the direction of having some kind of identified formal leaders team, or leaders, that we look for a team of people. And in prayer groups that are not limited communities or full communities, there can be people on that leaders team who don't have the kind of fullness of maturity and fullness of gifts that you'd expect to have in an elder who is going to head a community. You can have people who are getting underway in Christian maturity, and people who have enough gifts to keep a prayer group together, but who might not, if the community ever changed, be a person you'd say he's the head of the community at that point. There can be in this period of time in the community's life people on the pastoral team who probably would not want to be an elder in a community because they wouldn't be able to, for example, guide somebody's life, which is what an elder does in a full community. I'm going to say a few words about how a prayer group establishes a leaders team. I know most of us have gone through this, but I'd like just to lay out some of the elements of the process, because I think that many of us will be able to help others who are trying to establish the same thing if we can contribute to our understanding of how it works. And in examining the way in which leaders teams that I know in prayer groups have been formed, one of the first things I've noticed is that in all the ways that it happens, there is a strong contribution in the initiation of the process from leaders already. That is, those who are natural leaders tend to influence the decision to move ahead to establish a team very strongly. I've been in several different prayer group situations. In one situation in Grand Rapids, the two men who were the natural leaders of the prayer meeting evolved kind of automatically into being the leaders team. In Grand Haven, there was an informal leadership, and after a year or two, a few of those leaders said to the others, we think that we need to have a more formal pastoral team. We think that these two people are the right people, and those two people who aren't leaders right now recognized are the right people, and that 6 of you ought to go into different kinds of service. So that at the initiation of leaders who were already leaders in the group, a more formal, responsible team was selected when the group had more maturity. I don't want to overstate the role of the leaders in doing it, but I think that it's a key thing. I don't think that, and you might contribute in the discussion to this, but in my understanding of the way it normally happens, it's at the initiative of those who are already taking some responsibility, or of those who are being raised up in the group to take responsibility, that the move to having some kind of pastoral team is initiated. And I personally think that's the right way that it should happen. I think that that's the way the Lord is doing it. I think that's the way that it should happen in groups. I think that that those who are members of the prayer group need to be involved somewhere along in the process of selecting their own leaders, and can be. I think that the more mature the prayer group is, the more the group can contribute to selecting the team members. So that, for example, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, we were in a situation of building a leaders team for a new prayer group that was going to be launched 2 years later in Muskegon. Our prayer group in Grand Haven committed ourselves to people from a town north of us to involve them in our life, to let them become leaders, and then launch them in a prayer meeting 20 miles to the north of us. And it was a three-year process that we went through. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, we felt that the Muskegon members of the community were mature enough to be able to begin picking a pastoral team to take responsibility for what was going to happen in a year or so for the open prayer meeting, which starts on January the 8th after we get back. What we did was to have a series of teachings on what leadership was and what Christian maturity was, what you should expect in a leader of a prayer group. And then we asked the people from Muskegon who were fairly well mature in the Spirit, or who were coming to some kind of maturity in the Spirit, who were they willing to follow? And we didn't have an election, but we said, go aside. We prayed about it one evening. Everybody went aside for half an hour and prayed, and everybody made up a list of the people from their town that they would be willing to have on a pastoral team. The men of the community who were coordinators also at the same time, the men in the prayer group who were heading the prayer group, and we call them our pastoral team coordinators, the coordinators prayed about it as well. And we made up our own list of who we'd pick. And after we counted up the people that got the most mentions on the list, it was identical to the list that we had selected by our way of analyzing who it should be. And I think the process works where in a mature group where you prepare the group with teaching and understanding, the group can say who they think ought to be on the team. In groups that are less mature, I think there needs to be some kind of consultation with the group, more or less, depending upon the situation. In the very early days when I was in the prayer group in Grand Rapids, what we did was to, as we added people to the pastoral team, we explained it to those people in the group who had some commitment to it, that we thought that so-and-so was ready to be on the pastoral team, and we wanted them to accept this person as one of their leaders, and would they do it? There was no election, but there was never anybody coming saying, we can't do that. It was always somebody that was selected that was obviously a person that they were following, that they were taking as a leader already. One thing that I've learned over the past year and a half that has helped in let me back up a bit. I skipped over a section that was out of place. I'd like to plug it in here. What are some things to look for in people who ought to be put on leaders' teams, or invited to be on leaders' teams, or selected for leaders' teams, however you want to say it? That's a very hard question, I think, and it might be described in a number of terms. If I'm looking at people that in that group from Muskegon that I wanted to see raised up, I look first of all for people whose lives were pretty much in good order. Pretty much in good order. That is, they didn't have everything worked out, but they were the kind of people who, when they saw something wrong, were really eager to correct it, and who had a good relationship with their spouses and their children, and who were people who, or if they were lay people, that they had a good living situation. I look to see how the Lord was working with them. Were these people, for example, who in some way contributed to those necessary gifts the group had to have? For example, was there somebody who had a gift of seeing what the Lord was saying for the community, even in a very limited way? Somebody with a sense of direction for the community that might contribute to the whole group's deciding the direction. Was there somebody who had the gift of bringing the group together? Somebody who could pull the group together and get it to move ahead in some way? Groups need that kind of person. If there's somebody in the group that can do that, maybe only even in a limited way, perhaps he should be on the pastoral team. I look for people who people follow in a good way. People who are recognized as those the group is willing to let them lead them. For example, sometimes a group just will not follow a certain prayer meeting leader, and you know that there may be reasons for that, and that would not be the kind of person that you would expect to identify on a pastoral team. But the ones that people are willing to follow are very likely the right people. Another criteria that I look for is that does this person seem to have an instinct for what needs to happen to make the group go right? I know that's hard to pin down, but is there somebody who in discussions says, I think if we did it this way, it would really work? somebody that has a sense of, just a sixth sense, a spiritual sense of what has to happen for the group to be going in the right way. Deciding who ought to be on the pastoral team in a prayer group is not as crucial a question as who ought to be the elder of a community, and therefore it's not a disaster if some mistake is made. In some cases, it is a disaster, and there is a way of preventing that. It's a disaster if somebody is selected to be on a pastoral team, and a year and a half later it's discovered that this was really a mistake. Here we have laid hands on Joe to be one of the members of the pastoral team, and a year and a half later we find out that he really was not the right person, and you can think of any X number of reasons why. How do you undo that? Well, that's one of the questions we're going to talk about tomorrow, but it's not easy to undo. That's the answer. There mightn't be a way of undoing it in a good way, but there is a way to prevent that from happening, and that's a principle that we're learning more about, and it's a very simple principle of being temporary about decisions like this. We have recently selected in the Muskegon group 2 men to be responsible for the whole prayer group as kind of like the coordinating group of the pastoral team. One of them was one of the original heads of the community, or heads of the prayer group. The other one is a person who has been on the pastoral team for a while, and when we went to him and to suggest that he might take this responsibility of being one of the heads of the pastoral team in Muskegon, we didn't say to him, "We'd like you to become head of the pastoral team." We said, "We think that you're the right person to take this responsibility. We have every good reason to believe from everything you've done that you are the right person. We've prayed about it, we've talked about it. Would you pray about it too? And when you become, if you accept the invitation and the group accepts it, then you'll become temporary head of the team for a year. And after a year, the whole team will talk about it, and you'll talk about it, and you'll decide, and the team will decide whether that was the right decision. So that there's a kind of flexibility being built in. If Don turns out to be the wrong person, and he could, right now he looks like the right person, in a year when we review it, he might very well say, "Well, look, I tried, I can't do it. Please let me off." In some cases, the problem arises when somebody says, "Well, I am the right person," and everybody else says you're the wrong person. See? But if you've talked about it with flexibility at the beginning, you can go to the person and say, "Well, it's a hard situation, and you've done a lot of good, but the whole group feels that you aren't the right person and would like you to begin doing this service instead of the overall headship." That principle of flexibility, I think, is something we ought to seriously consider as a principle for building all of our relationships in our leadership structure, so that people will, from the very beginning, face up to the need for being evaluated and for being honest. If we haven't got a gift to do it, or if our lives get out of order in a serious way, if something goes wrong, there is a way of having us transferred into something else with the least difficulty. I'd like to take up another question that I announced in the description, and that is, when you're building leaders' teams, how do you take somebody who is a good new leader with a lot of potential and then involve him in overall leadership in a prayer group? That's a very important question, because I think one of the things that the Lord wants to do with prayer groups is to raise up new leaders for the whole church. That's one of the things Steve didn't say this morning about what prayer groups can do. I've been living in a prayer group for 5 years, and there are men leading in our prayer group who 5 years ago didn't know the first thing about prayer. And they're overall leaders and taking responsibility for things. And they're going to be leaders in the Lord's church in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do had it not been for the prayer group. And therefore, learning how to bring people along in giving them the experience of being good leaders in a prayer group can make a very positive contribution to the future life of the Lord's plan in the Lord's church. So one of the serious responsibilities we have is learning how to spot people, to test people and bring them along and give them responsibility and train them in leadership. I'd like to just talk about a number of principles that will help. One is a very important one, and it's in several places in the Scripture. I'm turning to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And I'm reading in first of all, in verse 6. This is the description of what the presiding elders ought to be like for a Christian community. And I think a lot of this advice applies to the leaders of prayer groups, but not to the degree it would for a leader in a community. But it says that a leader should not be an overall leader, should not be a new convert. It says that pride might turn his head, and then he might be condemned as the devil was condemned. And then it says a little later on, in chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, in verse 22, do not be too quick to lay hands on any man, and never make yourself an accomplice in anybody else's sin. The point is, in that text, in both texts, is that we ought not go too fast with people. We ought not go too fast in bringing people into overall responsibility in a group. And there are no people who are newly coming alive in the Spirit are not ready to take overall headship in a group. And you might chuckle at that because many of you here, I'm sure, are in the situation of having come recently into a new life in the Spirit and been made responsible for something like a prayer group. Many years ago, when the renewal began, that was the normal thing, to have been baptized in the Spirit one day and put in charge of the group the next. But now I think we're far enough along where we can, in organized groups at least, we can take time. And there are clear reasons for that, and I'm sure you know them as well as I do. People who are turning to the Lord for the first time in a deep way need time to work their life, to get their own life worked out. They need time to respond to God's call and to straighten out all the clutter and to get on top of all the problems. So that even though we might see people coming through the prayer group who have made a real response in faith to the Lord, and who show a lot of promise, it's not really fair to them, in their terms of their own growth, to slap them with heavy responsibility too soon. Another reason is that leadership formation is not something that happens overnight. That is, I know what God did with me, and it took many years to take me through many different processes before I could be an effective prayer group leader. You know, and it happened at stages. You know, at first, what there was I was back in Grand Rapids in the early days. I gave the explanation talk for about 6 months to a year before anything else happened. And then there were no such things as Life in the Spirit seminars, but we all got experience in doing different parts of the life of the group. It was a year and a half or so before I led a prayer meeting, and all kinds of things had to happen step by step, stage by stage to get it all together. That happened kind of like gradually and without much external control for me. But now we're in the position of taking the time to get people through various different stages of growth as leaders, and we ought to be doing it actively. Taking our time, being gradual about it, and being sure that there is a variety of different experience being provided. I think the person who comes into overall leadership, just like in good business practice, has had experience in every area of the business. A person who is the overall leader in a prayer group ought to have gone through every area of leadership in the group. And when you become an employee at a bank and you're on your way up to work in the bank, you work every job all around the bank before you become the assistant vice president. Well, I think the same thing ought to be true. The person who is the overall head of the prayer group ought to know what goes in to administering the end of setting up the chairs in the prayer meeting. He ought to have done it. He ought to have had been responsible for it at some time. He ought to know what goes into being a discussion leader in a Life in the Spirit seminar. He ought to know what goes into being a person who gives the explanation talk. He ought to know what it means to be responsible for the prayer room after the prayer meeting. He ought to know what it means to lead the prayer meeting. He ought to know what goes into helping people get into service. And what we do in Grand Haven, in a very organized situation, is that we try to spot people who look like they have some kind of possibility of being an overall leader. And if they can restrain me long enough, we give them about a year to get their lives in order and straightened around, and then we begin to involve them in things, in serious, and give them responsibility, first of all, over something administrative, and then we begin to involve them as discussion leaders in seminars, and maybe with somebody who's really a very exceptional prospect, give them responsibility for the explanation room for a while, take them through every element of the life of the group, and at each point giving them more responsibility, so that step by step we see whether they can do it. And using the principle of saying, well, we think you'll be able to do it well. We have a lot of confidence in you. If it turns out you can't, well, we'll do something else. Okay? We'll work right with you and help you along. But if it doesn't work out right, praise the Lord, and we'll move into something else. So that the principle of flexibility is built right into the process all along. That's an important thing, and perhaps that's the most important thing I'm saying, that if we're going to be responsible to help other people take overall responsibility, we need to enter into a brotherly relationship with them. We need to open our lives with them and share our lives with them and have real affection with them. Take a brotherly responsibility for them. You know, Steve's talk did not say that only those in full communities have the responsibility of brothers one to the other. We have that, and that's one of the values of being in a prayer group, and one of the values of giving our lives to each other in that way. We do take a brotherly responsibility for each other, especially for those who are going to be coming up into responsible leadership in the group. And that means that I think it means we do invest a lot of time with people like that, and encourage them. Review their personal life with them and share our personal life with them in some kind of way. Pray with them. Talk to them about their service. Take an active interest in what they're doing. Not let them go off on their own in what they're doing, but to be with them. That involves a serious commitment from those who are trying to do it. That is, it involves a serious commitment of the leaders of the prayer group to help others become leaders as well. And one of the things that happened to me, and I bet it has happened to some of you, is that we tend to spend more time with people that are having serious problems, emotional and psychological or some other kind of problem, working them out, than we do with people who show a good possibility of being leaders. A year and a half ago, I suggested to our other leaders that we were being spent in counseling people who weren't getting well very fast, and that perhaps we weren't being called right now to do that. What we ought to do is invest our time with the best and strongest people in the group and get them trained up to be good leaders. Give minimal care to the problems, help them and include them, but not be spending so many hours a week at it that we were neglecting bringing the people who were strong into full responsibility. I'm not saying everybody is called to do that. Maybe you are called to spend your ministry with people with very serious problems, but we did for a considerable amount of time make an effort to commit ourselves to spend a lot of time with people who needed to be helped in being overall leaders, with the idea being that once we have more people taking responsibility, then we'll be able to generate more care in a responsible way for people with serious problems. Once you begin doing this, another question is, well, how do you, after you help people become more responsible leaders, or be in a position to become more responsible leaders, how do you give them authority? How do you include them in an already established authority in the group? How can it be that, for example, in our group, when we raise up new overall leaders, people won't still come to Bud or me with what they want to talk about, but will go to the right person who has been placed in authority? There has to be a real inclusion in responsibility when people are put on leaders' teams. And that's not easy to do. It's not easy to do sometimes because a lot of it, unfortunately, gets built around personality. But I think there are ways of helping people to be included in the authority. And I'd like to share some of those things. First of all, I think people need to be given real responsibility to carry things through. That is, when you have somebody who has come forward and has come to some maturity, they should be asked to take responsibility, and they should be allowed to do it. They should be allowed to do it in the way that they've agreed to do it, but they shouldn't have too much meddling in it. That is, they should be allowed to do it. And they should be held accountable for it. If they make a mistake, it can be corrected. Presumably we're going to be choosing people who can carry things through fairly well. Mistakes won't be disasters. And they can be corrected. But if we don't give people real responsibility and trust them to do it, and then accept what they do, and not go back and undo it and do it over again our way, as we've got to begin to submit ourselves to them as well. If they do it, it's successful. It's not quite the way we'd have done it, but it worked well enough. We should accept it that way. And we should deliberately find ourselves surrendering ourselves to them in discussions and in meetings. It should not happen that new people on teams begin just simply to be yes men to the strong people who have been there before. What the older members who have raised up the new ones ought listen to and surrender their mind to, and submit their mind to the minds of the new people on the team, and not in any kind of phony way. It ought not just be for the sake of doing it. It ought to be, here we're bringing in a new brother or sister to work with us, and what they have to say has equal voice with mine. And if I find myself not agreeing with the other three on the team, even though I'm the original founder of the prayer group, I'm going to say, well, I don't quite agree with everything there, but I see the Lord working in my brothers and sisters here, and so we're going to do it their way. Another thing that needs to be done, I think, is that in more organized groups, you need to involve the whole community in recognizing somebody. So that if the community suggests that Joe be placed on the coordinating team, and he is, then the team needs to present Joe to the community and say, okay, we've done it. For the next year, Joe is going to be a temporary head of this community. He is responsible for the life of this prayer group, just like Mary and George have been. And the three of them together are going to be responsible. And we want everybody, since you suggested it, we want everybody to accept that. And his particular responsibility is going to be to head the Life in the Spirit seminar program. If you have any questions about that, the first place to go is not to Mary, whom you've gone to for the last 2 years, but it's now to him. He is the one responsible. And then Mary, when somebody comes to her and says, I don't think that last seminar worked quite right because this didn't happen, Mary would say, well, go talk to Joe about it. That's his responsibility. It used to be mine, but it's now his. So that part of it is giving him a clearly defined area of responsibility, and then refusing to take over what ought to be his. That is, respecting what his authority is. If your prayer group does delineate authority that way, to refuse to step in. That's the way I've had to work in Grand Haven. People who come to me and say, well, the last seminar should have happened this way, I'd say, go to Bud. Bud is responsible for the seminars, and Bud will bring it to the coordinating team. He's the right person. Or if they say something about the situation in Muskegon, I'll say, well, Stan's the head of the Muskegon situation, and you should go to Stan first about that. And if Stan doesn't feel he can handle it, he'll bring it to the whole body of the pastoral team, and we'll all talk about it. But he's on top of that, and he knows what to do about it. So that way, everybody is sharing the authority, and no one person is cutting it short. And that way, new people can begin to take the responsibility that God wants them to have. Today we're going to talk about, in the talk, about 3 special problem areas. And in the discussion, we can go back to things we talked about yesterday, if you like. We can take up these problem areas that I'm mentioning, or you can raise up other questions that you find that are questions that you have because of the workings of pastoral teams. The reason I selected these three areas for discussion, that is, in the talk, one being how to handle disagreements and conflict, another being how do you make changes in membership on pastoral teams, and a third being how does a pastoral team keep in good contact and communication with the prayer group, is that in a 2-day long session this past summer, a team of about 15 or 16 people who were preparing for this conference and for the regional service conferences were sharing what they saw to be some of the main problems they had encountered themselves in the areas of having pastoral teams. And these three were three critical areas that were ordinarily or commonly shared in that group. I'd like to just make the observation that at that meeting this past summer to talk about these workshops, one of the commonest things people agreed on was that charismatic groups tend to be as healthy as their leaders groups are. That the success of a prayer group even is very much affected by the quality of life of the men and women who are on the pastoral team. And that if the pastoral team works right, if the relationships are right, and if the Christian life that they're living as brothers and sisters is growing right and in good order, that gets communicated to the whole group. But when the leaders group is faced with difficulties that it can't cope with, or when there are relationship problems between them, that gets communicated to the whole group as well. So that if we're going to be responsible stewards over the work God is doing, and to follow the line of speech that Kevin took this morning, and build with the Lord, then it means taking care to build sound relationships and to work through things in the right way in our leaders' groups, because that's going to be communicated to the groups we work with. Even in a prayer group, even where the headship and authority is worked out in a way that's not as deep or as definite or as to the degree that it is in a full community, that still gets communicated to the people in the group. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first area, in a general way. What I'm going to talk about is developing good relationships on the pastoral team as a lead-in to talking about handling disagreements. One of the things that Steve began the whole weekend, or our whole conference with, was the observation that what the Lord really wants to restore is Christian brotherhood, the relationship between brothers, which is at the very essence of our being Christian. And in order for that to happen, we're being put together in groups. I made the point yesterday that I thought that the headship in a prayer group ought to be a team ministry, and I explained why. And I think the deep reason for that is that what God is doing is making us brothers and sisters and teaching us how to be that way. And I think that even in a prayer group, and I don't mean to say even in a prayer group in a way that disparages prayer groups, in a prayer group where the pastoral team takes responsibility for activities, the basic relationship ought to be that of brothers and sisters. We ought to look upon ourselves not first as leaders, but as brothers first, and as brothers and sisters first, so that we can have that relationship right as the foundation for the work we do in the prayer group. One of the elements that I want to mention in this regard is the way in which brothers relate when they're working together. And a way to describe that relationship is mutual submission. It's the kind of thing that the Lord calls us to in Ephesians 5, where we're called as brothers and sisters to submit one to the other. Or in the first part of the second chapter of Philippians, where we're told to see to it that there is no competition or jealousy, but that everyone places the interests of others first. In pastoral teams or leaders teams that are working right, I think that you'll see a group of brothers and sisters who are submitting to each other. And where that's happening, the right environment is being created to handle the other kinds of problems that there are. I want to talk about helping to correct some of the problems that we encounter, but I want to preface it by making the observation that the best way to handle difficulties in prayer groups and to handle the other kinds of problems that occur is to lay the right kind of foundation, to create a relationship among the leaders in the group that's a brotherly one, where they're brothers first and taking a responsibility in a brotherly way for each other's lives. That's the right context for dealing with problems. And where that foundation hasn't been established, it's going to be very difficult to work with problems. If we're a kind of committee of people who take a concern for the prayer meeting and we relate in a political way, for example, that is, I represent this group, you represent that group, and we have some things that we haven't worked out, but we'll get the work done. That can work for a while, but I think that's not what God is calling us to. I think God is calling us to be brothers and sisters so that we can work in a way that's different from the way that things are handled in the worldly environment that we're placed in. If we are submitting to each other as brothers and sisters, that creates a relationship that will protect the quality of life in the group. It means that, for example, we won't be relating in a political way. We'll be careful not to relate in a political way. For example, if I am submitting to you as a brother on a pastoral team, I will not try to advance my position to get my way. I will be saying, God is working here. I think the group is being led this way, but everybody else says something different. The temptation would be for me to say, no, God says to me we're going this way, and my way is the right way. But when I'm in submission to you on a pastoral team, and the other brothers say, well, we think that the Lord is leading it a little bit differently than you see it. The right way for me to relate to that is to say, well, I see it differently, but I'm going to submit to what God is doing here in the brothers. I'm one voice, they're three. They hear the Lord too, and they're serious about their commitment, and so am I. There is the chance that I'm wrong. One of the biggest problems that appears now and then in the renewal is somebody presenting himself or herself to a group as the prophet that has the vision for the group. That's a very hard problem to correct, and I haven't got a lot of wisdom about correcting that one, but I know how to prevent it. The way to prevent it is to work in teams that are in mutual submission one to the other. Even in that case, it's difficult to deal with situations where there are some very serious problems, but the temptation to set myself up as God's voice to the community is prevented somewhat by my being in submission to you and accepting correction and testing from you. And I think that is one advantage that comes to the group from being in mutual submission to each other. Also, the right foundation, I'm not going to say very much about this next point, but I want to at least mention it. The right foundation for a pastoral team that works well is to have people on the team whose lives are in good personal order, and to have the order of relationships on the team worked out well in advance. I don't want to talk too much about this because this is the substance of many of the talks in the regional service conferences this year. That is, the ways of having pastoral teams work together more effectively, working out a good order in their meetings and so on. And I don't think that I need to do any more than mention that at some point in our working together as a leaders team in a prayer group, we need to work out a way of working together. For example, we need to agree on how we're going to make decisions. We need to talk about how do we bring this matter to a decision. What does it mean to make a decision? Is it going to be by majority of the team or by consensus? What if somebody really objects? How are we going to handle that? We need to have some understanding of how decisions are going to be arrived at. At what point do we consult the prayer group? On what questions do we consult the prayer group? On what questions don't we consult the prayer group? If that's worked out in advance and talked through and agreed to, that creates an orderly way for the members to function, to relate together, and that creates a situation where brothers would be able to disagree in an orderly way, and it won't create confusion. It won't create confusion unnecessarily or bad feelings unnecessarily if the good order of the relationships are worked out in advance. A number of other things that are good to think about doing, I just mentioned them very briefly, is to have somebody act as a kind of head for the pastoral team, to be responsible, say, for example, for convening meetings or for setting agenda. An agenda can be set by somebody saying, here's the agenda, and everybody else contributing to it right at the beginning of the meeting. Planning together in the future what's going to be talked about at meetings. This kind of thing helps have a good orderly relationship, and that's, along with loving each other as brothers and submitting to each other, creates the right situation to handle conflict, disagreement, outbursts of anger, whatever it is that creates the problem. I'm persuaded that it's possible for us to be brothers on the team or sisters on the team and to disagree in the right way. That coming together in the Spirit does not mean that we're going to automatically have to agree about everything. And that if we're relating in the right way and loving one another and respecting one another, respecting the commitment of each other to the Lord and to what God is doing, that we can say, I don't agree with that, and here's why, without causing confusion, without causing division or a split in the group. I think that is possible. It's possible even to disagree about some very serious things. It's possible, for example, I think, for heads of a prayer group to disagree on ecumenical questions, for example. I'll give you an example. We have in our prayer group, which is a thoroughly ecumenical group, we have had at times on our pastoral team a Protestant minister and an elder in the Baptist church, along with Catholic laymen. And there were some basic disagreements there on some very crucial Christian questions, like on baptism. And because we were a prayer group where those issues did not raise themselves as urgent concerns, they would be more of a concern if we were a full community. But as a prayer group where we were sharing certain activities but not our whole lives, those issues were not, they were big issues, they were important, we differed. We even talked about, in some cases, where we disagreed, but they weren't the kind of disagreements that created any kind of bitterness or division. But there are other important kinds of questions that we could disagree on that had to be resolved or we couldn't go ahead. For example, if one member of the team thought the Lord was saying we're going to be a full community, and the other one said, no, we're going to be a prayer group, that's the kind of disagreement that has to be resolved. Otherwise, the group really can't go ahead at being what God's calling it to be. I think we can learn how to disagree in the right way, in a way that protects what God is doing and protects our brotherhood. I'm going to make some suggestions about some things that will help us to disagree in the right way. Perhaps you want, this may be an area where you'd like to comment, in particular later on in the discussion. I think that we ought to, when we're disagreeing, when we're in a meeting, for example, or with a brother or sister, and we have something we don't agree with, that before we raise the objection or they open the question, we ought to examine ourselves and ask ourselves the reasons why we have the objection. That is, we ought to say, do I have a clear conscience about what I'm doing here? Is my reason that I really have a good reason for saying this is wrong, or is there something deep in me that's getting expressed here? And, sometimes disagreement is rooted in a bad relationship. I'm jealous of somebody, or somebody has corrected me and I'm getting defensive and I want to find some way to get at them. And I think that a good way to approach disagreeing is to ask myself, have I got a clear conscience here? Is my reason really that I think this is a serious issue, or is my reason connected to something that needs to be healed in me? So that I can if I'm going to be disagreeing, it ought to be for the right reason, and not because of some problem that I'm having. A second thing I think is that when we are going to disagree, we ought to take measures in ourselves so that we don't disagree disputatiously, that we don't make our disagreement as a way of doing something that the disagreement ought not do. If there's something at issue, I ought to raise the issue. But if I ought not raise it in a way that simply causes unnecessary concern. I have been on leaders' teams with brothers who thought it was a good thing to play the devil's advocate. That is, to raise objections when there weren't objections, really, except to see if they could find something. And I think that while there are some advantages to behaving that way, that to continually raise objections as a kind of devil's advocate could be disputatious and could be a source of a difficulty unnecessarily. Another thing that I think is difficult too is that that we ought not raise disagreements disputatiously in a way that it challenges somebody's responsibility or authority. That is, we ought to raise them in the right way. We ought not raise an objection. For example, if our prayer group has some kind of head for the pastoral team and we've submitted to him or her, the reason for raising a disagreement ought not be to challenge him or her in terms of their position, but rather ought to be, here's something that we have to face and I don't agree with it, in a way that respects their office, supports their office, but at the same time expresses the objection. I think it also helps in considering questions that we disagree on to even before we raise a disagreement, to make a distinction between matters that are very important and crucial and matters that are important but not major, and matters that are not very important at all but we don't agree with. I think it's worthwhile considering talking about this among ourselves and saying, members of the leaders team ought to be able to say, this is such a serious matter for me that I'm going to have to stop the process in some way. That is, I really have a serious objection, and until it's resolved or until something is done about it, I don't think we ought to do it. But we shouldn't be doing that for everything. I think we should consider in ourselves, is what I'm about to say, the disagreement I'm about to make, something that really counts? Or is it something that's a minor thing that I could say, I've got some problems with it, I'm not sure I could agree to it, let's talk about it, and I'll go along with it for the time being, but if it begins to well up in me as a bigger and bigger thing, I'll say something about it again. Or to proceed in a way that says, I've got some serious reservations, I'm not sure what they are, maybe we ought to wait a while, I don't want to stop the whole process, but I'd like to say I've got some problems with it. I think we ought not to be always raising every objection as though it were as important as every other. We ought to make those distinctions as a body to help us to disagree in the right way and not to create unnecessary disagreements. Another thing that helps too is to learn how to raise difficult areas at the right time and in the right way. We know that some areas are very sensitive and we don't agree on them. And therefore, the right way to raise them is to plan for it, perhaps, to agree on a process for handling the question, or to be careful not to raise it at the wrong time. I've learned this more in my family than I have in leaders groups, but in relating to people, I know that when I am, for example, corrected, I tend to want to, raise up something that that's a sore point with somebody else. And if I don't take action to correct that, it's going to produce, instead of brothers working together to get over obstacles, it's going to create more obstacles. I suggest that all of us ought to learn to trust one another, but also to refrain from raising a disagreement, an area where we know there's going to be disagreements at the wrong time, say in a tense situation. When we've handled one tense issue at a meeting, it's not a good idea to raise another one where we'd find ourselves taking on more disagreement. That is something you might want to discuss a little further later, but I think that's a very important thing. I remember, and just share something personal at this point, I remember with a younger brother in our community having a lot of conflict in our own personal relationships. And our relationships, we began to face those things openly, and we noticed that this is one of the things we tended to do, was to raise issues that we didn't agree on at the wrong time. What we decided to do was, or what I decided to do personally was, that when this brother raised something that I disagreed with, that I would deliberately not do anything more than talk through that one, and even if I had 5 more things that I wanted to talk about that were sensitive, that I would save them for a different time, maybe a few days later, or a time when the relationship wasn't a bit affected by my defensiveness. And I found that since I've been doing that we have some conflict, but it's handled in a much more brotherly way with a lot less distress. And I think just learning how to talk about things in the right way at the right time has been a big help in minimizing the conflict. All these things that I'm talking about are principles of order, I think, that help to create a situation where we restrain or control conflict or disagreement. Well, how do you get at the roots of things where conflict is not caused by some misunderstanding, where it's caused by personal problems? I think we need to learn how to correct one another, repent of wrongdoing, and pray for healing in these areas, especially among leaders on teams. One of the things that I want to say in a preliminary way, and maybe it doesn't really fit right in connection with the observations I'm about to make, but I'd like to make the observation that I'm going to recommend that we have repentance and prayer and fraternal correction. But I want to say this before I do it. I think that we are sometimes tempted to pass over a difficulty by saying, let's pray about it. That we think that the spiritual way to deal with a difficulty or a disagreement, that the really spiritual way, because we're charismatic and we're baptized in the Spirit, is to say, we'll pray this one through. And I've become more and more convinced that it's sometimes turning to prayer, while it is the right thing, you've reached an impasse, and you pray it through, and the Lord shows you your way through. But other times it's the wrong thing to do, to stop a discussion, to pray about it, where the decision to pray about it is a desire not to face the question or the issue, but is really a kind of escape. I think that the Holy Spirit can guide us in talking about things right while we're talking about them, even though we're talking in sensitive areas. And I think we ought to learn how to distinguish between praying about it as wanting to break off and not work something through, when what the Holy Spirit wants to happen is that we work it through. In the kinds of leaders groups that are relating as brothers, I think correction is something that can happen, and can happen effectively with a lot of good fruit. I think we're learning a lot about being able to correct one another. I'd like to just share a few things. Perhaps you will have something to share about it later. I think we have a lot of wrong attitudes about correction, and a lot of fears about it. And one of the reasons that we don't we don't do it is that we're afraid that if we do it, it will ruin the relationship. And I think my problem with that is that if I need correction, and you presume that talking to me about it is going to cause a problem, somehow that says that I really don't want to be corrected, that I want to be wrong, that somehow my commitment is not right. If I refuse to correct you when I know that something is wrong by saying, I wonder if there isn't something wrong in the situation, if I'm afraid to do that, I'm making a judgment about you in a sense. I'm saying, well, if I make the correction, that'll just ruin everything. But I think we're brothers and sisters. We can say we want to be corrected where we're wrong. That's a part of our submission to each other. And if I say that, if we're open about that and talk about that, it's possible then to say, in this particular case, I think there's some wrongdoing that needs to be corrected, and here's what I think it is. Shall we talk about it? And the brother that's corrected can respond by explaining the situation, and the two together can work out a way of dealing with it. It's not always that easy, because we're not always relating in the right way. We're not always being the kind of brothers and sisters that we ought to be. But I think what we ought to be moving towards is relating in the way where correction is possible. I think that this kind of correction is a way of getting at those difficulties that are behind disagreements and conflicts in groups. One of the biggest problems with correcting brothers and sisters, however, is a tendency to overdo it and to do it in a careless way, or to do it in a way that challenges their commitment to the group or to the Lord or to each other. And I think that one of the most important things that I've learned in the area is that when we're correcting one another, we ought to be very careful to focus on the wrongdoing, but not to challenge the person or his commitment. That is, when we are saying to someone, I think something is wrong, it's the something we ought to ask about. And we ought not in our heart or in our manner or in our way of speaking challenge our brother's commitment or himself in any way. Because wrongdoing can be repaired. We ought to always expect that our brother's heart is in the right place. There's something wrong here, but he's a brother. And I know he loves me, I know he loves the Lord. What's wrong then can be corrected because he wants whatever's wrong to be corrected. That's the right frame of mind to have about something that's out of order, I think. That protects the person. That respects his life with the Lord. It protects our relationship. And then the wrongdoing can be corrected because his heart is in the right place. I think it's also important that we don't adopt the notion that somehow we're our brother's judge, following all the scriptural warnings against that. Rather, we ought to regard ourselves as somebody pleading for him, somebody who takes the model of the Paraclete who is our advocate, advocating for him, wanting the situation to be healed, not so that we can achieve something against our brother, but rather so that the situation be healed, that our brother might move ahead in the Lord with us. There's an instrument, or a couple of instruments or tools that help deal with problems in relationships that are caused by wrongdoing. And we're learning a lot about these things in the charismatic movement. One is the simple, straightforward principle of defining what's wrong and defining wrongdoing through agreements. And some things that cause problems in relationships among leaders or among anybody, among any group of people, are things that aren't really wrong, but things that bug us. And if you do something that bugs me, I'm the one that has the problem. No, unless, of course, we have talked about things and have agreed that this particular action that's not wrong in itself is not something we want to have in our relationship. For example, I have a weakness, and I tend to tease people a lot. And I know it's a weakness that the Lord wants to heal. And I have agreements with several brothers that say that if I tease them in a certain way, that's wrongdoing, and I've got to seek forgiveness for it. It's not wrong in the sense that I'm committing mortal sin to do it, but I've made an agreement with a brother that this is not a right way for us to relate. And therefore, if I do it, I want him to say to me, remember our agreement. And then I can say, I'm sorry that I've done that, and he can say, you're forgiven, and the relationship is clear. Because the teasing got to the point where we were having a problem. It began to make that person feel I didn't really like him, even though I like him very much. Well, there are things like that operate. And using agreements, like Kevin talked about this morning, and using the simple principle of seeking and granting forgiveness can clear our relationships and remove the clouds. And there's also another matter is simply saying, I love my brother. There's some things that he does that I wouldn't do the way he does them, but I love him, and that's a part of my relationship with him is to forbear what he is, forbear that, and to do it in a heartfelt and generous way. I think when individuals in leaders groups discover that it's things wrong in them that are causing the disagreements, and not objective things that are out of objective things that can be disagreed with, there's a need for ministry of healing and prayer for repairing that. If I discover, for example, that it's a sense of competition, or a wrong kind of aggressiveness, or something in me that's causing disagreement in the group, then I would want my brothers to tell me about it so that I can receive ministry for it. I think we ought to have the kind of submission to one another where that's possible, and go about doing that for each other by turning to the Lord for the healing that we need when we discover the roots of our conflict in those ways. How do you begin? I'm talking from the context of where everything is right. How do you begin to do this where everything's not right, where everybody's not submitting to one another, where the team does have bad relationships, or where disagreements aren't handled properly? I have a number of things I want to say, and I don't think there's any easy way to tackle that. And I don't know whether it's even appropriate that too much advice be given in a talk like this about that, because I've had the experience in the past of giving advice and people going away from it saying, we heard at the conference that this is the way you handle that, and this is what we're going to do. And that is not always the way things work. I think it makes sense to be very careful and cautious about the way that we proceed. If we sense that there's something wrong in our leaders team, I think it would be a good thing to pray and to fast and to expect the Lord to work, but then to raise the questions with my brothers and sisters, but in the right way, in a gentle way, in a way that says, I think we ought to talk about this. And I'd like to get together at our next meeting and talk about it. It should be done in the right way, in a way that does not challenge anybody, but in a way that says, I see this problem. Can we talk about it? That's one, and I think that is the right way. One of the right ways to proceed would be to pray and expect the Lord to work, and then to begin to raise some of the key problems. If it's possible to begin developing a brotherly kind of relationship in a casual way, by developing friendship and trust and through informal meetings without trying to tackle problems, that might contribute to the right kind of environment to begin talking about the difficult things. There's in cases where there are very serious problems that we don't know how to handle. Some groups are finding some profit, and I'll just to mention this as something that's happening. I'm not so sure I know much about it or how it works right all the time. Some groups are asking groups nearby to help work out some problems. That is, in cases where there is a difficulty on a leader's team where the team doesn't know how to handle it, they've looked to a brother or sister group nearby where there are responsible people and asked for some kind of help. And that often is a very good way to, I think it's often a very good way to begin working on this kind of problem, to ask somebody from another group to talk with us about it. Maybe just to listen to us about it. I'm not suggesting any formal kind of mediation, but I am suggesting that maybe what is leading the charismatic movement to consider groups taking a brotherly responsibility for a group in the same way that we take a responsibility for each other in the groups. Now, there are two more areas that I want to talk about, but I'm going to do them very briefly because both areas were floating through the discussion yesterday. One of them is making changes on pastoral teams, and the other is communications between the team and the prayer group. Now, as a prayer group becomes an organized prayer group, as a house prayer meeting becomes a prayer meeting that has services attached to it, frequently the person who was the host of the home prayer meeting finds it difficult to be effective as a leader on a pastoral team. Not that the person is any less holy, or it's just that the group has changed. It's gone to a point where his gift doesn't go. And he or she finds themselves on a pastoral team, unable to do everything that has to happen. And there are other situations like that seem to call for some kind of change. Sometimes leaders who have deep problems, people with deep problems become leaders in pastoral teams. And then those problems don't come to the surface until the team is well along the way, and then it appears a year later that some mistake has been made and somebody with a problem has been asked to be on the team. And sometimes people who are well develop difficulties as they go on. Sometimes they need to be I think they need to be replaced with somebody else on the team. These are some of the cases. You might be able to think of other cases where some kind of change might be necessary. But the point is this: for the sake of the person involved and for the sake of the group, a change ought to be made when situations like this develop. For the sake of the group, because groups, in order to go on with the Lord, need to have leaders who have the ability to handle the situation, whatever it is. And for the sake of the person, because it's an unloving thing to leave somebody trying to do something that they really can't do. In our experience, over the past 5 years in Grand Haven, we've had a number of times when we've had to decide, after a long prayer and consideration and discussion, to ask somebody not to be an overall leader anymore. In one case, the person was very happy to have been asked because he felt that he was being asked to do things he didn't have the gift to do, and he was really happy that he was able to move into doing something where he was comfortable. And when the change was made, it was apparent to those who were leading in the group that it was a wise decision, because from that point on, meetings went differently. Meetings up to that point had to make up for what this man couldn't do. We were spending a lot of time saying, well, how can we approach this in a way that X will be involved and feel a part of it? I mean, more attention was being paid to try to help this person do what he didn't have, even say he had the gift to do, than was being paid to getting the work of the group done. I said yesterday, and I'll just repeat it now because some of you weren't here, that I think we have a tendency to sidestep this question, to we tend to know that something needs to be done, but we kind of pray and hope that something will happen and that the situation will change. And sometimes prayer is the right way to handle it, to pray that the person that seems to be God's choice develop the gifts that he needs to do the job. But sometimes we aren't dealing with people who are, quote, God's choice for the job, and the gift doesn't appear. Or there is a person with a gift develops a problem, and something needs to be done. Something needs to be done, and if we don't do it, what happens is that it gets worse and harder to handle later on. There's the converse too, and that is that sometimes we're not the ones to do that. That is, I've said this at meetings before and found that people misapply it by using the teaching to as an attack on a good leader in the group that they were trying to find some reasons to remove. And therefore, we're talking in a very delicate area, and applying what I'm saying needs to be done very, very cautiously. And I think it needs to be done in submission to others. That is, I don't think that as individuals we ought to try to tackle this, but rather if there's something wrong, it ought to be something that we do consulting with other brothers and sisters, and not something that we do try to do by ourselves. Discovered by the experience of being in groups where we've tried very hard to encourage brotherhood and good relationships, that changes like this can happen with the least injury to the person. And being brothers and sisters is, I think, the most important precaution we can take to do this in the right way, and to do it in a way that does not injure the people who are being talked with. But even so, I think we also, while we're being gentle and careful and just and taking every precaution to be that, we need also to be firm about it. When the group of brothers has decided that there is something that needs to be changed, we ought to go ahead and explain it. And we ought to use the real reasons in explaining it, I think. When we're considering a situation where a person needs to be changed, I think it is inviting difficulty to take a reason that's not the real reason and give that for the change. To say, if you think a person really can't be the overall leader because he hasn't got the gift for that, or because he has a problem that he's working on, the best way to approach it, I think, is to speak about it honestly and say the real reason. I don't think you can be on the pastoral team anymore because over the past year you have just not been able to handle these situations, X, Y, and Z. And you yourself said that you didn't feel that you had a call to do this. Instead of saying, we think you ought to be the treasurer of the group because you have a gift for finances, you see. Because the time will come when the person will want to be back on the pastoral team, and there may be a time in the future when this person who was wrong now might be the right person then. But even so, if we don't speak the truth, we're inviting future difficulties, and we're also preventing the person from getting the kind of healing in an area where if it's a person with some kind of problem. Sometimes we approach changes because somebody's been charged with serious wrongdoing. And if that's the case, I suggest that we be doubly cautious, or trebly cautious, and proceed very slowly. Because there are two sides to every story, and we ought to be scrupulously fair and cautious in taking action in cases like that. And we may need help. We may need help in handling that kind of situation. Help from people who have experience in that kind of in the area that maybe that we haven't got yet. I'd like to say a few things about communications between the prayer group and the pastoral team, and then we'll have a discussion. A common problem that the pastoral teams experience is losing contact with things. what tends to happen, at least what's happened in a number of Michigan groups that I know, is that a leaders team is chosen and is invested with responsibility for a large area of things in a prayer group, and invested with the responsibility of making decisions. And they meet regularly and talk about things, and there begins to be a lot more understanding of how things go in the leaders team, and they begin to move ahead and do things, but somehow there's a gap between what's happening with them and what's happening with the group. And in our experience, there are times when we've seen things really very clearly that ought to happen, but because our communications were bad, the people in the prayer group were saying, well, now, why are we doing this? And I don't think that's right. And, well, who made this decision? And, what's happening here? Why is it going that way? We didn't hear about that. And there begins to be something bad happening between the leaders and the prayer group. And when I use the word prayer group, I have in mind an organized prayer group. I should make that clear. I don't mean a prayer group that simply has an open prayer meeting, but I normally mean one that has gone to the point of having a kind of gathering of those who are committed to it in some way. That is, I'm talking mainly about communicating between a pastoral team and an organized prayer group where there are some people who are identified in some way as the people who keep the prayer group together, people who are serving in the prayer group, or however you define it. I'd like to make a couple of quick suggestions about preventing that situation from happening. First of all, I think that we ought to create an attitude in our own hearts and minds that works against the tendency to become removed from the group. And that is, we ought to repent of the notion that being a leader is a kind of a status. And we ought to look at being a leader as hard work in service of the brothers and sisters. And the more we do that, the more we're going to have the right heart for being with the brothers and sisters. There ought not be a kind of subtle, even unconscious caste mentality forming in us where we kind of somehow regard ourselves as the special group in the prayer meeting, but rather we ought to be saying, being on the leaders team is hard work, and I do it because I love my brothers and sisters and I want to be with them. I think if we repent of any kind of status seeking and work with our brothers and sisters in the prayer group, that will be a good precaution to this kind of gap developing. I also think that we need to consider working out ways of consulting with and informing the people in the prayer group. We talked about this to some degree yesterday. There are all kinds of forms and structures being worked out to make that happen, and I think if we don't do it, we ought to consider doing it. That is, there ought to be all kinds of things are possible in large prayer groups, for example, where you have several hundred people coming. It's possible for the pastoral team to have a newsletter. In large prayer groups where there's an organized core, it's possible to have some kind of advisory group. Everybody the group can choose an advisory group that meets regularly with the pastoral team. In our group, for a time, the leadership of the prayer group had agreed with the prayer group members that we would not make any major decision that would affect the life of the prayer group without consulting with the advisory team. There were 20 people on the advisory team, and there were four people on the pastoral team. There was a monthly meeting, and each time there was something that would change the direction of the group. At least we were committed to talk it over with the advisors and normally involve them in making the decision. And on very serious matter, we agreed that we would not only talk to the advisors, but also to the whole community of those committed people to the prayer group before something serious would happen. So that it takes a long time to get a decision made in changing direction. That's good, I think. But the idea is that some kind of body of people who are a part of the committed group can be consulted. You can talk to people about it. They can raise their questions. They can raise objections. And then the people who have the responsibility of deciding and with the group have made the right kind of contact. And they can be held responsible for the decision. Sometimes it's possible it's a good idea to have, in an organized prayer group, to have a kind of sharing session where the pastoral team would ask the community, where do you think the Lord is leading us? And simply, in a prayerful way, one by one, share what God's been saying to you in your prayer time, and everybody listen to what's being shared, just to keep the group in contact with the Lord and with each other. I don't think we ought to be afraid of that kind of discussion and consultation. I think that if we don't do it, we aren't really being responsible to what God is doing in the whole body of men and women who are together. The way a group gets direction is from the whole way God works among everybody. And therefore, it's not really effective listening to God for the pastoral team simply to listen to what God is saying to them. They need to be in touch with everybody else in a regular way. Some very well-organized prayer groups have got communications networks worked out, where certain people are simply responsible for being in touch with a number of people every week, just to tie people together, to communicate things, to ask what God is saying, and it takes a considerable amount of organization to do that, but there's no reason why an organized prayer group couldn't handle that kind of thing. Sometimes when you hear a talk like this one where problems are talked about and very, very delicate areas are raised, we begin to think about things and begin to lose heart about situations that we may find ourselves in. And I think that it's I sense the Lord asking me to call us all to have hope in Him for difficult situations. I think that Ralph was speaking the Lord's mind to us this morning in the general session when he called us to be aware that the Lord is at work and that we shouldn't grow tired of doing good. I've sensed in a lot of people and in a lot of places, not in all but in some places, a tendency to be wearing out and to be facing difficult things that they don't want to face anymore. And I think that we need to call each other to a renewed hope and a renewed life and to a renewed joy, to realize that Jesus Christ, the Lord, is our strength and He is our joy and our peace, and that He would not have put us where we are if He didn't intend to show us a way through or to give us the strength to go through difficult things. And I suggest that we turn to Him and put faith in Him and have hope in Him for working out all the difficulties that we do encounter in our leaders' groups.